Hi everyone, this is Dr. V with this week's video lecture on individual differences. This lecture is presented in a critical thinking enhanced format. This means we won't work our way through the elements of thought as we proceed, but rather, as I discuss various aspects of individual differences, I will ask you to engage in critical thinking exercises. Remember, even though the elements of thought won't be specifically invoked, you would do well to try to bring them in yourself. It's nearly always a good idea to think about the purpose, the principal issues, the most important concepts, and the implications when you approach a question in this video. At other times, bringing in other elements of thought are also good ideas. This video is part of a transition. Rather than covering it as a logic of model, as I did in some of the earlier lectures, where I cover the elements of thought, here I'm asking you to decide on your own when to invoke a specific element of thought. This should help as you move from this course and into other courses that are non-ACT courses throughout your degree. The elements of thought and the standards of intellect will always be important to you, but they won't always be discussed. Individual differences make up one significant part of what makes us unique. They combine with our socialized self to shape who we are and how we perceive things. These bases of perception, in turn, become the biases that we live by every day. I've said repeatedly this semester that biases are necessary. They are the glasses we use to see the world. However, being blind to our biases is dangerous, because just as our biases help us see some things certain ways, they can cause us to mistakenly see other things and to miss some things altogether. As we proceed through this lecture, we will focus on our individual differences, the building blocks of our personality. The goal of this lecture is largely one of self-appraisal. It's about you learning things about yourself and then identifying how those personality attributes shape the way you view the world. Being aware of your own biases is the beginning of recognizing and respecting the biases of others. Your textbook opens up with a discussion of various types of intelligence, and I want to discuss emotional intelligence in some greater detail. You may recall that emotional intelligence was the topic I chose in my SEEI way back in the video lecture that introduced the idea of SEEIs. While some aspects of individual differences have been studied for many decades, emotional intelligence is reasonably new, with only about 20 years or so of research behind it. In its short time in study, though, we've already become aware of just how important emotional intelligence is. It turns out that emotional intelligence is one of the better predictors of leadership capability and is similarly a strong predictor of your ability to influence as well. Emotional intelligence begins with empathy. Empathy is, per the dictionary, the intellectual identification with or vicarious experiencing of the feelings of, the thoughts or attitudes of another. Okay. What that means is that empathetic people recognize and understand the feelings that others have. Not just how they feel, though, but why they feel what they feel, and additionally, what those feelings are pressuring that person to do. Our emotional state, our affect, drives our behavior, and empathetic people understand the emotions in others and how that's influencing their behaviors. Emotional content and communication largely comes from our nonverbal communication. While there are certainly people that will explicitly tell you how they feel, most people express their emotion through various aspects of nonverbal communication, and we talked about nonverbal communication in a chapter earlier this semester. So to some extent, being empathetic means you can read the affective pieces of nonverbal communication as they are given off by other people around you. But there's a lot more to being emotionally intelligent than simply being a good reader of emotions. Emotionally intelligent people think of emotions as tools. They recognize that our emotive states motivate us to perform or behave in certain ways. Emotionally intelligent people are skilled at helping shift the affective states of people around them towards an affective state that is suitable for the situation at hand. Emotional intelligence by itself then is very much like the toolkit metaphor we've used on and off this semester. To be emotionally intelligent, you need to understand a broad range of emotions. You need to understand the language, the nonverbal communication associated with that emotion, and you need to identify when and where different emotions are useful or harmful. Given that, you need to be a skilled communicator and gifted at the use of power and influence to shift the affective state of people around you. Emotional intelligence, like leadership, is an integrative capability that brings together many of the ideas that we've read about and discussed this semester. Okay, to summarize, I just stated that being emotionally intelligent requires 3 specific affective skills. 1, you need to have a working knowledge or awareness of different affective states. 2, you need to be skilled at reading the nonverbal language cues associated with those affective states. And 3, you need to recognize where each affective state is beneficial and where it's harmful. Now, understand when I'm talking about affective states, I'm talking about emotional states. So you need to understand those 3 things that I just said in the context of emotion. That's what I want you to do I'm going to want you to tackle the first 2 of these things in this initial journal entry. I want you to build a 2-column table. The first column should list emotions, and the second column should describe the nonverbal communication cues that you associate with that emotion. I want you to create a list of 10 emotions that somebody might experience in the workplace. Don't worry about a reason right now. Just list in the first column and across the 10 rows, give me 10 different emotional states. Now, I also want you to try to arrange them in a manner that keeps the most similar ones close and the most different ones apart from each other. Then, for each emotion that you list in the second column, give me a couple of nonverbal cues that you might expect to see from somebody who is experiencing that emotion. So column 1 is a list of emotions sorted and organized. Column 2 is a series of nonverbal cues, more than one per emotion, please, that would help you understand that somebody is feeling that emotion. So, how did you do on this last entry? Was it easy or hard to come up with 10 emotions? Were most of your emotions slight variations of each other, or did you imagine a wide range of emotions and affective states on your previous entry? How about the nonverbal cues? Was it easy to imagine the tones and the postures and the expressions that we associate with each emotion, or did you find yourself overlapping in your explanations quite a lot? The more varied your emotional listing and the more specific and non-overlapping your nonverbal communication explanations, the more likely it is that you already have developed a fairly good sense of empathy. If you struggled on the last entry, that's okay. But recognize this is a gap in your skill set. Understanding emotions and recognizing how they look is a very important skill for leaders and managers. On this slide, I've given you a fairly comprehensive list of different types of emotions. This research is published by Dr. Robinson, does not appear in your textbook. It's a useful way to think about your first journal entry, and it's going to be used to set up our second journal entry. But look at the table for a minute. Notice that there are both positive and negative emotional states, and that there are 5 different categories of things that we associate with the emergence of. These are causes, or these are the way we feel about things, or the way specific things make us feel. The 5 categories are how we feel about things specifically, how we feel about the future, how we feel about the past or present, the current situation, and how we feel about ourselves, and then finally how we feel about others, our social feelings. For each category, there's a positive and a negative set of emotions, and in many areas, there are several emotions that are similar to each other listed on the same row. So for instance, interest and curiosity are both positive emotions that are associated with how we feel about things. The table is also structured so that negatives along the same row are negatives of the positive along the same row. So alarm and panic can be thought of as opposites of interest or curiosity. So think back to your first journal entry. Did your emotions cover a number of these categories or only a few? Did you have positive and negative emotions that oppose each other? Did you identify emotions like joy and triumph which are largely similar to each other? Remember, I suggested that emotional intelligence requires 3 skills: awareness of emotion, recognition of emotional communication, and understanding of when and where to apply emotions. I'd like to focus on the latter one of those here in this journal entry. Which emotions are useful in which places, and in which places are those same emotions harmful? Emotions are a tool that helps us stimulate or suppress behavior. Knowing where and when an emotion is useful, and where and when it is harmful, is an important step towards using emotion. I want you to build a 3-column table for this next entry. In the first column will be a list of emotions. In the second column will be situations where it is helpful to feel this emotion, and in the third column will be situations where it might be harmful or at least unwise to feel the same emotion. I want you to choose 2 positive emotions and 2 negative emotions on this list. I want you to, for each of those 4 emotions that you're going to list out, I want you to identify a time when it would be useful to experience the emotion at work, and I'd like you to identify a time where it might be inappropriate to experience this emotion at work. Please avoid choosing heavily overlapping emotions like elation and triumph, and please also try to avoid using direct opposites of each other like hope and fear. Make yourself work through at least a range of emotions and feelings and fit as you do this exercise. When we think about individual differences, one of the bases that makes us different is our personality. Personality is the various ways that we behave, as well as the various patterns in how we perceive things. Our personalities shift slightly over time, but within any specific window of your life, for college or your early career, your late career, etc., your personality is likely to be fairly stable. Additionally, while your personality will drift as you move through windows of your life, it is unlikely to change substantively. Put another way, while a moderate extrovert in early adulthood is likely to remain extroverted over the course of their life, the extremes or moderate levels of extroversion for this person are likely to shift over time. There are 2 basic ways that we classify personalities. One is based on behaviors, and the other is based on cognitions or perceptions. Behavior-based personality batteries classify and describe a person by the patterns of behavior they exhibit. We can, for the most part, classify other people fairly accurately if we watch them often enough, in enough types of places. More on that idea later. Cognitive-based personalities or perception-based personalities are classifications that are based on what a person thinks and the way the person perceives things. To measure these types of personality batteries, we actually need to ask the person about how they view, feel, or perceive things, and we look at the pattern of the responses they give us instead of the patterns of behavioral actions that we see to help us assess their personality. From a workplace perspective, behavioral personality batteries tend to be a pretty good predictor of on-the-job performance. Since behavioral batteries tell us about the patterns or the tendencies of a person to act a specific way, these types of batteries are likely to repeat themselves in the workplace. These types of behaviors are. The Big 5, depicted here on this slide, is perhaps the most popular of the behavioral-based personality patterns. The Big 5, also called Ocean, classifies types of behavior patterns into 5 categories, with each category anchored by different sets of behaviors. They inquire individually as to whether a person is open to new experiences or grounded in habits and traditions, whether the person is conscientious about their responsibility to others, or a free-willing free spirit beholden to none but themselves, whether the person is an extrovert who prefers the realm of people, or an introvert who prefers the realm of ideas, whether the person is an agreeable person who tries to suppress conflict, or a competitive aggressive person who seeks out conflict, whether the person is a neurotic whose emotional state fluctuates often and unpredictably, or whether the person is emotionally stable whose affective emotional states rarely shift, and when they shift in very predictable ways. If you take the first letter of the first word for each dimension of personality the way I've listed them on this slide, you get the acronym OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N. In academic research, this personality set is usually referred to as the Big 5, but in corporate applications, I'm beginning to see the acronym OCEAN more and more often. But understand both names, Big 5 and Ocean, refer to the exact same 5 personality dimensions, draw from the same research, and produce the same sets of implications and expectations. It's safe to say that the Big 5 is one of the most widely studied and widely deployed set of personality batteries in business research. It is heavily used by human resources personnel in candidate selection. The Big 5 is a very stable battery. Your scores in the Big 5 are not likely to change very much over the course of your life. It's also a very predictive battery. We know that specific relationships exist between these personality batteries and job performance. That's why it gets used in the workplace quite a bit. Conscientiousness, for instance, is nearly always a strong, positive predictor of job performance. Now, there is an exception here when you talk about somebody who has an extreme level of conscientiousness. For those people, the rigidity and the structure in their personality becomes actually disruptive. But there are very few people that have that extreme level of conscientiousness. More commonly, though, just being slightly more conscientious or more conscientious makes you more likely to be on time, more likely to be prepared, more likely to be responsible to your work duties. Therefore, conscientiousness is nearly always a positive predictor of job performance, and it performs this way in virtually every job setting that I've ever seen it used in. In fact, if I see a new Big Five study, I can pretty much guarantee that conscientiousness and job performance are going to correlate because they always do. Emotional stability is similarly a very broad and very positive predictor of job performance. Emotionally stable people are more predictable in their moods, and they're generally easier to interact with as colleagues and coworkers. As with conscientiousness, I'm unaware of any study that has failed to find a positive relationship between emotional stability and job performance. So, conscientiousness and emotional stability, those are stable. Those are always, every job setting, they're very good predictors. But the other three are far more situational. Extroverts, for instance, tend to get more promotions than introverts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that extroverts are better leaders, because introverts wind up being very good leaders. People that are high in agreeableness, this tends to be a very important attribute in high-stress situations and conflict-rich work environments. So law enforcement personnel actually tend to perform better when they have a high level of agreeableness in their personality. But in other settings, agreeableness can actually turn into a negative predictor of job performance in places where you need people to be aggressive or you need people to stimulate conflict. Openness to experience turns out to be a very strong positive predictor of job performance in certain settings, like customer service and technical support. But in other places, there are times that you don't want people to be creative and open to experience. You want them to be very traditional and habitual in how they perform. For this journal entry, I want you to find out how you measure up on the Big Five. Underneath this video on Blackboard, there's a link to a Big Five personality assessment website. I want you to go to that website, I want you to take the assessment, and then I want you to record your results in this journal. Just to kind of, where did you land as an extrovert, where did you land as in conscientiousness, and so on and so on. Once you've described your scores on each of those five, you could just be a listing of the numbers, I want you to tell me, how did their assessment of your personality match up with your perception of your own personality? Was there anything here surprising to you, or is it pretty much what you know about yourself? Now that you've taken the Big Five and thought about how it applies to you, I want to talk about what the range of numbers mean for each of the different measures of the Big Five. Each dimension of the Big Five is independent. Your tendencies towards extroversion or introversion, for instance, have nothing to do with your tendencies towards emotional stability or neuroticism. However, in you, the five different dimensions that your specific scores on those five different dimensions combine together in a way that's uniquely you. Understanding that about yourself should help you recognize the ways that you act, and thus possibly recognize the ways that you perceive things and the situations that you're likely to be more successful in. But those five things coming together in you in a unique way can also make it easy for you to conflate two dimensions as overlapping. As an example, if somebody who took this assessment was very open to experience and very non-conscientious, that person would be very freewheeling, very beholden to nobody, tries out new things at whims. And so a person like that might think that openness to experience and non-conscientiousness, the opposite, the far end of the negative end of conscientiousness, just go together. But they don't. They just do in that person and possibly no other person. Independent measures mean that they are not related. So the five dimensions of the Big Five are independent of each other. They are not related to each other. So while somebody could be very conscientious and tradition bound, somebody could also be open to experience and flighty, but you could just as likely be conscientious and open to experience. In fact, many researchers are thrilled to try out new things and explore new ideas, that would be open to experience, while remaining very, very faithful to academic rigor and processes and the responsibilities to document and detail their methodology, which would be conscientiousness. Independent relationships means that all possible combinations of those relationships are possible. It's also important to recognize that for each of these personality dimensions, the midpoint of the scoring spectrum simply means that there's no affinity in either direction. Somebody who has a middling score in extroversion, for instance, is predisposed towards neither extroversion nor introversion. This also means that moving towards introversion from the midpoint doesn't just mean they're moving away from extroversion. This isn't like a thermometer where you get warmer or colder, and every degree up or every degree down can be thought of as the same type of a change. Rather, moving along the personality dimensions is a lot more like moving east or west, with the midpoint being your starting point. Moving east from a starting point is not the same thing as moving less west. It means a totally different thing. It means you're moving towards one thing and moving away from another thing. So understanding personality means that you have to recognize what things are in this east-west sort of metaphor for things for each of the dimensions. So being more introverted doesn't mean that you're less extroverted. It means you're more of something completely different. Being introverted means a predilection towards one set of behaviors and a lack of tendency towards a totally different set of behaviors. The things we associate with extroverts aren't simply more than the things that we associate with introverts. In other words, it's not simply, extroversion and introversion isn't simply a measure of the number of people you like to hang out with. It is very much about what the extrovert likes to surround him or herself with, as opposed to the types of things that an introvert likes to surround him or herself with, and recognizing that it's different things, not just in quantity, but in quality. They like different things. Extroverts and introverts are like east and west, not warm and cold. This is actually true of all of the Big Five and most of the other personality batteries that we're going to cover in this lecture. But for now, let's just focus this around extroverts and introverts as the Big Five defines them. For your next journal entry, please do the following. Tell me, 1, what are some of the things that an extrovert is likely to enjoy? 2, what are some of the things an introvert's likely to enjoy? And remember, it's not more and less, it's different things. Once you've answered those two things, then the third thing I want you to do is I want you to talk about how are they different besides simply being more or less. Where the Big Five personality batteries classifies personality through behavior, the Myers-Briggs typology classifies people through their cognitions or their perceptions. Myers-Briggs looks for tendencies and perceptions and classifies people between 4 different dimensions. The first, extroverts who gain energy from being around other people and lose energy when they're invested in thought, and introverts who gain energy while thinking and lose energy around other people. The second dimension are the intuitives, who really enjoy abstract thoughts and complex relations, versus sensing people who prefer to see direct cause and effect and reject abstract in favor of black and white categorization. The third dimension are the feeling type of people who reach their conclusions primarily through the emotions and how they experience affect, and the thinking type of people who reach conclusions through logic and rationality. And then the fourth category are the perceivers who try to understand things unto themselves, independently of other things, versus people who are judges who understand things by how they relate to other things, and specifically by rank ordering and better or worse and good or bad sort of approaches. So put together, these 4 batteries tell us a great deal about how a person experiences the world around them. This doesn't wind up being as predictive about your on-the-job behaviors as the Big Five does, but it tells us an awful lot about the points of view a person has, which in turn tells us a lot about how they learn, and in turn tells us about the types of information we need to provide that person to help them make conclusions. For this journal entry, I want you to take a Myers-Briggs type assessment. Now, it's important to understand that the Myers-Briggs inventory is actually a fairly expensive one to take, but there are similar classification systems out there that are built off of the same Jungian model for personality. One such free example is provided in the link below this video. Please go to that link, take the assessment, and record your 4-letter profile in the journal entry. Once you've done that, please also tell me how did the scores and how did your rankings on this assessment match up to how you perceive your own personality? Were there any surprises, and in which areas were they consistent with how you know yourself? Subjective reality has repeatedly been invoked as one of the fundamental concepts of management. The point has always been that each of us experiences the world differently from each other. Our gender, our ethnicity, our home cultures, our life experiences each combine to shape these perceptual differences. But our core personality also shapes these perceptual differences. Each of the 16 possible Myers-Briggs combinations perceives the world differently from the other 15 Myers-Briggs types. Even when viewing the same phenomenon at the same time in the same place, an ISTJ perceives and understands it completely differently than does an ENFP. You can't use the same reasoning or facts to convince an ISFJ as you would to convince an INTP. In a very real way, this classification represents 16 different languages and perspectives on the world around us. For nearly everything that matters to managers, navigating these differences is the key to success. It also turns out that in the United States, at least, there's not really an even split between each of the 4 different dimensions of Myers-Briggs. Well, it does turn out that there's about the same number of extroverts and introverts out there. It turns out that there's a there's a good number more judging people than there are perceiving people. There are also, similarly, many, many more people that are guided by their feelings than those provided by their thinking. It also turns out that a person's Myers-Briggs combination does a reasonably good job of predicting the type of work setting that will appeal to a person. So it won't tell us specifically how you're going to perform on the job, but it will give us some indication that you will prefer to be in work in settings where the sensory data you receive is consistent with your preference set and the things you like and the ways you like to perceive the world. For example, academics, college professors, tend to overwhelmingly be intuitive thinkers. That's the NT combination. Even though the 4 different NT combinations highlighted in yellow on this table combine to make up less than 10% of the total population in the United States, they actually turn out to make up the vast majority of people who choose to become professors. Now, odds are that you were not an NT, so when you took the Myers-Briggs assessment, your scores probably came back as something other than an NT. You may have been one or the other, but probably not both, but you may have been. 90% of the U.S. population is actually either an SF, an NF, or an ST. What I'm saying here is that in all likelihood, you are probably profoundly different in terms of how you take in information and process information than the various professors you interact with. In fact, I'm actually very much one of these NTs. I am actually an INTJ. I'm an intuitive, mildly introverted, intuitive thinking person who tends to judge. And you're probably not. So my point here is that if you've ever asked a professor a question and had them respond with a lengthy answer, which made absolutely no sense to you, it's quite possible that personality differences were playing out in that conversation. Assuming that you were actually fully studying, you had read up on the material, and you just didn't understand the prof's response, it's likely because the way that professor perceived and assembled the idea is just radically different from the way you perceive and assemble things. You were, in this case, speaking completely different languages about the same thing. For entry number 6, let's turn our attention to the most pronounced difference in the U.S. population as measured by Myers-Briggs. The United States tends to have far, far more sensing people than it does intuiting people. You, for instance, are far more likely to be sensing than intuiting. You're also more than twice as likely to meet somebody who is sensing than to meet somebody who's intuiting. Your employees and your coworkers are far more likely to be sensing than intuiting. But regardless of which one you are, you're likely going to have to manage people you manage some mixture of both sensing types and intuitive types. So what I want you to do for this journal entry is I want you to imagine that you're preparing to host a meeting for a group of employees that report to you. And I want you to think of 2 things. First, what type of information would your sensing employees prefer to hear about, and what does that look like? What does that information look like? So your sensing employees like to get information in what type of context and hear about it in what type of format. And then second, what type of information would your intuiting employees prefer to hear about, and what would that look like? So what I'm asking you to think about here is, how do you talk to your sensing employees versus how do you talk to your intuitive employees? And as a manager in a meeting, how do you make sure you do both? How did you get where you are today? Are you here because of the choices that you made, or are you here because of the choices that you were given? Did you create the situation you're in today, or is the situation you're in today the result of options that you're given by events happening around you? Mankind's always been interested in whether fate, the world around you, or agency, free will, the choices you make, are more relevant. Realistically, we understand that both of them are important. Your choices matter, but we've all seen a t-shirt or a bumper sticker that says stuff happens, although stuff is usually a little bit more of a colorful word when it's on a t-shirt like that. My point here is that agency, your choices, and situations, the world around you, both happen, and they both happen all the time. But we're not going to engage in the chicken or the egg philosophical debate about fate and free will here. We're going to instead look at how our tendencies to believe one or to invoke one or the other as an explanation for outcomes represents a very important dimension of personality. Locus of control, like Myers-Briggs, is a perceptual personality trait. It represents how you see the world around you. It represents your tendency to perceive and to explain the world as a series of individual choices, or whether you perceive and explain the world as a series of external forces. Now, this is very important. Locus of control is not about whether you control the outside world or whether the outside world controls you. But unfortunately, that's actually how many students misinterpret locus of control. Rather, locus of control is entirely about your tendency to attribute, that means explain, cause and effect as an outcome of individual agency, which is internal locus of control, or circumstances and situations, which is an external locus of control. Locus of control is about the stories you tell yourself and the stories you tell others as to why things happen. It represents your tendency to see some causal factors and to ignore others. This pattern of perception that exists within you shapes how you view the more and less fortunate people around you. Now, it's not about whether you're right or wrong. It's about your tendency to always invoke a certain pattern of responses to explain most phenomena or outcomes. I am not saying that choice doesn't matter, and I'm not saying that situations don't matter. That's not the point of locus of control. Your choices matter, but even so, the world around you still exerts an influence on the choices you make. Locus of control is entirely about your biases. It's not about reality. How you are more likely to view, your bias to how you are more likely to view the world around you is what we're talking about. Do you see the world around you as primarily a series of personal choices made by yourself and others, or do you see the world around you as a series of overwhelming social forces and situations? That's locus of control. For journal entry number 7, I want you to first, it's actually going to have two different pieces to this journal entry. First, the table on this slide identifies a couple of life outcomes or goals: getting a job, getting good grades, getting to work on time, and having a successful marriage. What I want you to do is to try to identify a set of internal factors, the choices people make, that can make these things happen. I also want you to describe a series of situational or external factors that can also cause these things to happen. So for the very first thing, take a moment and complete this table. That's the first part of this activity. Now, realistically, there are personal choice reasons and situational variables that can make or at least influence each one of these things. Odds are, though, one of these columns is a lot easier for you to fill out than the other, and that's very likely to be a pretty good clue as to what your locus of control is. But let's find out. Below this video is a link to a locus of control personality test. Go there and take this assessment. That's the second part of this assignment. How did you score on locus control? Is your locus of control consistent with your experience filling out the table? If you're an internal locus of control, you very likely found column number 2 very easy to populate, and you've probably found column number 3 very hard to write out. If you're an external locus of control, you probably thought of a few things very quickly for column number 3, and you probably had a little bit more trouble explaining column number 2. But remember, column number 2 and column number 3 both really happen. But as an internal locus of control, you're more likely to see column number 2 and forget column number 3. And if you're an external locus of control, you're more likely to think about column number 3 and see it and forget about column number 2. For the final 2 slides in this presentation, I want to turn towards stress management. We are presented with adversity to different degrees throughout our lives. Over the course of your life, you've developed a pattern that dictates how you deal with adversity. That pattern is one of your individual differences. Each person you work with has their own pattern, and understanding their pattern is a key to being able to lead them individually. Your textbook describes 4 behaviors that we use when we address adversity. Avoidance relates to our tendency to procrastinate and rationalize away the adversity. It doesn't actually make the adversity goes away, but it lets us postpone dealing with it. Coping behaviors occur when we attempt to apply some process to dealing with the feelings caused by the adversity. This could range from motivational talks to drawing on our personal faith to engaging in meditation or a number of other techniques. What matters with coping is that we're helping to counter the negative feelings associated with stress or adversity. Managing behaviors involve confronting the adversity head on, not the feelings of adversity, that's coping, but rather attacking the issues that are creating the adversity. Harnessing behaviors are similar to coping behaviors. They involve dealing with the adversity, or actually the feeling part of the adversity. Where coping helps you deal with the negative affect of the adversity, harnessing actually involves using the negative affect. When we discussed emotional intelligence earlier in this lecture, I pointed out that all emotions have a place in the time and they can all be useful if used correctly. Stress pushes us towards fight or flight, and harnessing the emotions that are associated with adversity can very much help you excel at whichever is appropriate, fighting or flighting. Who you are, where you have been, and what you've learned in your life has given you a pattern in responding to adversity. Understanding yourself requires understanding how you approach adversity. Managing yourself and managing others involves finding techniques to improve how adversity is handled. So, for the next journal entry number 8, let's imagine that you're taking a course at a university. The course you're taking is going to require you to complete a large, difficult individual assignment, one that you've never attempted before. The assignment's given to you in the very first weeks of the course, and it's going to be due at the very end of the semester. And the semester's a few months from now. So let's think about this in a 15-week semester. You get the assignment in week 1 or 2, and it's due in week 14 or 15. I want you to complete the Managing Adversity table that's on this slide. Now, try to be consistent with the way that you've approached projects like this in the past. Over the course of the 12 weeks or so of this assignment, what percentage of your time is spent avoiding the assignment? What percentage of your time is spent coping with the assignment? What percentage of your time is spent managing the assignment? And what percentage of your time is spent harnessing the assignment? Realize this isn't a highly adverse situation, and your responses here to deep adversity might be slightly different, but do try to answer this as honestly as you can and think, do you take a couple weeks before you get around to things? Do you do things specifically to help you with the stress of it? Try to be as honest as you can with your answer and look at that as an indication of your pattern for dealing with adversity. For the most part, we all have our own pattern for dealing with adversity. Some of us like to put things off to the last minute, avoidance, and then harness that last minute stress to try to punch through the problem. Others of us manage the adversity by dividing it into smaller pieces that they can work through. Others use coping techniques to help us mitigate the negative feelings associated with adversity, and those things help them endure the trial and they find themselves experiencing. We all have our way of handling adversity, but those ways are not equally efficacious. Some of our ways of handling adversity are quite effective and very good and very useful, and some are actually fairly dysfunctional and make things worse. For example, delaying dealing with a problem can often turn it into a much larger and now unavoidable problem. Improving your response to adversity involves these 4 steps. First, identify the ways in which you control or can influence the problem. What things are truly in your power to perform? Second, take ownership or responsibility for the aspects of the situation that are in your control. Third, understand the degree of impact of adversity. Does this have broad ramifications on your life or narrow ramifications? And then fourth, think about how long and over what period of time you're going to need to endure the negative affect associated with this adversity. What you're doing here is defining the adversity. You're recognizing that there are things you control and things you don't control. You're taking ownership of the parts that you can affect, and you're considering the breadth and time for which you must endure the crisis to help you with your coping and harnessing behaviors. So let's think back to locus of control for a minute. Remember, internal locus of control people tend to see the world as a world of personal choices, while externals tend to see the world as ones of environmental effects. Neither internals or externals precisely see the reality of the situation. They tend to overperceive agency, or they tend to overperceive the situational effects, respectively. Control and ownership are very hard for both internals and externals. Internals often see everything is in their control, and that's just not true. And externals often see virtually nothing in their control, when in fact there might be a number of things that they actually have control over. Working through control and ownership means confronting your biases. It means recognizing your abilities and the limitations to your abilities. For this final journal entry, let's try to use each of these adversity responses in a realistic setting. To develop a toolkit for adversity response, it helps to think about how you might counsel someone else as they go through adversity. So for this exercise, for journal entry number 9, either choose a situation where you have a close friend or relative that received a very bad grade on a major exam, and make it a very low grade to make it a very adverse situation, or alternately, consider a situation where a very close friend or relative might have had a major setback in their career or profession, so loss of a job or a failure to receive a desired promotion. But whichever scenario you pick, make it one that affects your friend very negatively. That's very likely to be a very stressful situation for them. I want you to prepare some advice for your friend, and I want you to be as specific as possible. Talk them through how can they take control of the specifics of the situation that you're describing. What aspects of the situation should they take ownership of? How broadly is this situation that you're defining going to affect their life? How long is this situation likely to be one that they're going to have to endure? Now, try not to simply repeat the definitions try not to simply repeat the definitions that I gave you earlier, the definitions in your textbook. That's not going to help your friend very much. Try to apply the definition to the situation you're developing. What can a classmate take control of, or a friend or relative take control of, to help them from a bad grade or a job loss? How deeply can a job loss or a bad grade impact that family member or that friend? How long are they likely to have to deal with this? How can they cope or manage? What can they do to help with the affect, and what can they do to help with the specifics of the issues that cause it? Try to be as specific as you can, and try to prepare good advice for your friend or for your relative. And please, in the entry, try to be specific about the scenario that you're trying to advise them through. That's it for this week's video lecture. This lecture was on individual differences. Throughout this lecture, we have focused on identifying your individual differences. I've tried to make the point that your individual differences, your personality, your approach to dealing with stress, the way you handle, the way you deal with the way you read emotions, things like that, these are all the things that create your biases that help, and they define who you are. It's important for you to recognize that those things shape the way you see the world around you. And it's important to recognize that the differences in your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, the differences in their personalities, the differences in their perceptions shape the way they see them. So to the extent that you can understand the way your personality affects the way you see things, you are slightly better positioned to be able to talk to other people about the way they perceive things. But as a successful manager, it's very important that you learn to talk to your employees through the language that they understand. So you need to begin by understanding yourself, but then you need to start to go back to some of these personality dimensions and think about how they apply to others.